Hi, my name is Matthew McCleary, and my paper is on the effect that climate change has on the migration patterns of animals. So, obviously, the effects of climate change are pretty well known, pretty well documented, right? We have um, melting polar ice caps, rising sea levels, just an overall rise in global temperatures. However, a lesser but arguably equally as important aspect of this global climate change is migration. Lots animals across all ecosystems and biomes and genuses all migrate. And these migrations, a lot of them, most of them are largely temperature dependent. Um, so the changing of a global temperature will have a massive effect on these migrations, and these migrations, a lot of them are very important staples of their ecosystems. So any shift in them would have like big effects across not just their ecosystem but several others as well. So obviously, one of the more common, the most common probably species that comes to mind when talking about climate change is the polar bears. And obviously, polar bears are affected by habitat loss, right? The melting of the ice caps. Um, and they, in this instance, are interrelated with the grizzly bears. So the grizzly bears have been ousted from 98% of their original habitat, right? The California flag still has a grizzly bear on it. They used to be all over the U.S., but now they're relegated to a small part of Yellowstone. Even though that population of grizzly bears in the continental U.S. has greatly increased recently, and they've moved more north, right? Um, and this is largely due to conservation efforts, but it has reached what some studies say is the limit of its sustainability. So it's not expected to expand anymore. However, far north, right, the grizzly bears that like live in Alaska, right, and that live in those northern regions, they're also doing the same thing. They're expanding north, right, and they're having more and more interactions with polar bears, and polar bears are already struggling with climate change, right? And um, these interactions, they're often over food sources, and it seems that the grizzly bears get the better of most of them. Um, a lot of times it doesn't come to violence. The polar bear simply leaves. But when it does come to violence, even still, the grizzly bears seem to be getting the better of the polar bears. So, on top of all they have to deal with their habitat loss, they also are experiencing these increased competition, which they're seemingly losing to the grizzly bears. And another very, very fascinating aspect of this increased interaction is hybridization. Grizzly bears and polar bears breeding, and they create what's commonly called a pizzly bear, right? But the pizzly bear is fertile, and it can reproduce. So theoretically, if these interactions become more and more common, we could see more of this hybridization species. And if the grizzly bears are continuing to get the better of these exchanges, we might see polar bears become slowly kind of subsidized into the grizzly bear population. Their DNA become just trace amounts eventually. Um, and that would effectively make the species extinct, right? As if they don't already have, enough going on in climate change. So that's a really interesting aspect of this, but also like a really unfortunate one for the grizzly bears that they now have to experience this intense competition. Another largely northern or mammal, whales, right? Whales are, they're famous for migrating all across the ocean, right? And they're extremely crucial to their marine ecosystems. So recently it's been observed that Arctic whales, such as the blue whale, have expanded their territory into even more northern waters, and species of subarctic baleen whales, including humpbacks, fins, and common minks, have been reported more often in Arctic waters. In the Antarctic, it's predicted that some of the ocean's most iconic species, right, the humpback, the blue whale, and the sperm whale, are all predicted to display a southward shift in feeding areas towards cooler waters. And another very important aspect of this is the breeding grounds of whale species. Many current humpback breeding grounds are predicted to become unsuitably warm by the end of the century. And a study was done in 2011 that predicted that 54% of marine mammals will experience an increase in range and 45% will experience a decrease in range. So that's such a massive shift in a century, which is not a long time in the grand global scale, right? So 54 will have positive effects, at least temporarily, right? We've seen with the polar bears and the grizzly bears a similar instance where it maybe benefits one but doesn't benefit another, and in the long run it hurts everybody. But aside from those indirect consequences. There's direct consequence for almost half the other animals where their range gets smaller. And it's just 1% where they're not affected. So the lead to the range expansion will lead to increased competition, and the species will be negatively affected by this almost certainly. Not to mention the ones that are having a smaller habitat now. So a change in whale breeding and feeding and migration and competition. Whales are such a crucial part to the ecosystem of the ocean that it could have massive effects. Just not even just in the ocean, but to all that rely on it, right? So it's a huge issue that these whales are so heavily affected by this. And when it comes to animal migrations, right, many people immediately think of birds. The migratory patterns of birds are almost entirely seasonal, and the timing of the bird migrations can be severely impacted if the temperature is unusual for a certain season, right? So this timing-based behavior is called phenology. It's like the timing of recurring biological events, right? So, for example, hibernation. And so, for example, recently we've seen the great tits, right? They're arriving early. They're arriving to their destination after they migrate early in the winter, and they're laying their eggs earlier. And this usually coincides with a type of moth. But the moths have tried to follow suit, but they're now laying their eggs too early. So now the moths are giving birth in a time and temperature in which they aren't used to, and the great tits, the juveniles don't have the food that they're used to having at this time. And then another negative impact of climate change is there are species, there are populations of Canadian geese that have simply stopped migrating. We see this in the Midwest United States. It was one where there was once a stopover destination is now just a permanent spot, and they aren't migrating anymore. And with the American forests becoming wetter, right, which is what a lot of southern bird species come here, for the drier temperatures. It's almost pointless to migrate for these birds. So some of them have stopped almost entirely, and it's such an important aspect that people often overlook. The climate change has all these effects, and it all comes together, and it's something that we really, really need to address.